Okay, I'm John Griffiths. I chair the cross-party group in the Welsh Parliament on poverty. And we have a really good gathering today of the cross-party groups and all-party groups from Wales, Scotland, and England. And it's a real opportunity to discuss what we all know is an absolute cost of living crisis at the moment, with food costs going up exponentially, fuel costs, people's heating bills, and virtually every aspect of people's everyday living. And of course, it's a huge worry to so many people. I should say at the beginning that this meeting is being recorded, as is normal procedure. And let me just say a little bit about some of the presentations we'll be hearing. I will be introducing the speakers now for this first session on the cost of living crisis, and the first part of the meeting will be chaired by Baroness Ruth Lister, and we'll be hearing about the economic overview that applies UK-wide from Rachel Statham of the IPPR. We'll be hearing about energy costs and fuel poverty from Fraser Scott regarding the situation, particularly in Scotland. And on food insecurity, we'll be hearing from Sabine Goodwin, and that will be the UK-wide position. We'll be hearing from the APLE Collective in England. And with regard to Wales, Caerau and Ely, a very deprived part of Cardiff, we'll be hearing about the situation there, and also from the Trussell Trust. So you'll be hearing from all of those speakers in very short order now. But I just wanted to say a few things, first of all, about the situation here in Wales. As we say, it's an absolute crisis. It applies right across the UK and much further afield, of course. But we know in Wales that it's not always easy for devolved governments to tackle these problems because they're very wide-ranging. And here in Wales, we know many of the levers remain with UK government. The tax and benefit system, for example, many of those levers are still with UK government. But of course, that's not to say that there aren't many things that can be done, and indeed are being done. So I just thought I'd touch on a few of those. So the Welsh government at the moment has put in place a £330 million cost of living package, which includes £150 cost of living payment, which is provided to all households in our council tax bands A to D, and to all households which receive our council tax reduction scheme. And that people in that scheme, that would apply to all council tax bands. And it's estimated that more than 1 million households in Wales will be eligible for the scheme. There's then a further £25 million provided on a discretionary basis to local authorities to help households who may be struggling. And the remainder of the funding is invested in a number of other schemes, all to help with cost of living, including an extra £21.4 million to extend free school meals through the Easter, Whitsun and summer holidays this year. We have more than £100 million invested in our discretionary assistance fund and the winter fuel support scheme for this financial year. And the extra funding in the winter fuel support scheme will ensure that we once again, this winter coming, provide people on low incomes with a non-repayable £200 cash payment towards their energy bills later this year. The analysis that's been done of Welsh Government support shows it's targeted at those who need help the most. Around 75% of households in Wales are expected to be supported in some way, but nearly twice as much will go to households in the bottom half of the income distribution compared to those in the top half. And 3 times as much will go to those in the bottom fifth compared to those in the top fifth. So it is very strongly targeted towards those who are most vulnerable. And with regard to the discretionary assistance scheme, we'll be extending support through the summer and winter to the end of March next year for off-grid households. So if they're unable to afford the next delivery of oil or LPG, due to extreme financial hardship, they will receive payments up to £250 for a one-off oil payment, or 3 payments of £70 for LPG. And then with regard to the real living wage for social care workers, eligible social care staff will receive the real living wage from April of this year as a first step towards raising the wages and esteem of that sector. And our budget for this year, the Welsh Government's budget for this financial year, includes £43 million to enable health boards and local authorities to implement the real living wage, recognising staff for the extraordinary contribution they've made during the pandemic. And just finally then, again, with regard to social care staff and this cost of living crisis, Julie Morgan, our Deputy Minister for Social Services, has announced an extra £96 million to make additional payments of almost £1,500 to social care staff who will benefit from that real living wage. And this again is part of our more general long-term ambitions in Wales to raise the status and the rewards for those in that vital social care sector. So, you know, that's just a quick canter through and an outline of what Welsh Government, or the Labour Welsh Government, is doing to respond to this cost of living crisis. But now let's move on then to the speakers that I mentioned earlier, and Baroness Ruth Lister.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I'm here in my role as joint chair of the APPG on poverty in the UK Parliament. I think it's the first time that we've had a joint meeting like this between the APPG and equivalent committees in Scotland and Wales. So it's very, very welcome. And as John said, we do face a real cost of living crisis. He mentioned the levers that lie with the Westminster government, particularly tax and benefit system, and unfortunately, the Westminster government has not so far chosen to use these levers to protect those in poverty. Just to say that please do, while people are speaking, put in any questions in the Q&A. The Q&A function, so that they're ready for when we get to that. But without any further ado, I will introduce the speakers, 5 minutes each. First speaker is Rachel Statham from IPPR, Assistant Director for Work and Welfare State. And she's going to give us an overarching look at the current crisis and how we got there. Rachel, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully now you can see a slide in front of you. Is that right? Great. I'm going to try very hard and stick to time, but really delighted to be here. I lead our Work and Welfare State programme at IPPR, but I'm also a Scot living in Cardiff, so particularly glad that we're doing a link up across parliaments, all of which are close to my heart. So where are we now and how did we get here? Unfortunately, as you can probably tell, it's not a very pretty picture. It's really quite bleak indeed. So inflation is now at a 30-year high. We know that wages and benefits are not keeping up with rising costs. We can see this in household energy bills. We can see this at petrol pumps. And we know this is affecting households across the UK. 90% of British households reporting rising living costs last month that's an ONS statistic. And the Office for Budget Responsibility have warned that this is really historic in standard. We're seeing the largest fall in living standards since the 1950s, since we've had records that are comparable. And we know that the situation is likely to accelerate further later in the year. So when we see a further increase to that energy price cap, that's all important in October, as is expected, big energy firms are expecting that 40% of people in the UK could fall into fuel poverty this winter, in Britain, could fall into fuel poverty this winter. So really quite serious indeed. How did we get here? So energy prices, as we all know, are a really important part of the picture. They've been rising dramatically for months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We've seen prices surge further. And we've also obviously seen the April energy price cap make a really big difference to household bills. And so we're seeing only the kind of early stages of what is a kind of accelerating crisis and greater pressure on household finances, but particularly on the finances of households that were already on a low income, whose budgets were already really pushed to the limit coming into this picture after the pandemic and after a decade of stagnant wages. So now we're seeing wider inflationary pressure, so rising food costs up 6% March this year on March last year, rising clothing costs, shoes costs, and furniture costs. So that's the kind of thing that's flowing in from these rising energy prices. We're seeing supply chain effects, and we're seeing this rise prices above the board, so in the supermarket, but also on larger purchases as well. And we're really poorly prepared for a crisis like this. It would be hard to absorb at any point. We've seen over a decade of living standards that have not been rising, wages that have not been keeping up to deliver a kind of better standard of living year on year, as we had previously come to expect. And many low-income households in particular have nothing left to cut back on but essentials. That's what we're hearing time and time again, that there really is no real room to absorb these new pressures. And what kind of response have we seen from governments across the UK? So as we've already had helpfully pointed out by John, a lot of the major levers we know are reserved to the UK government in terms of how we can respond to a crisis of this scale. So we've seen varied council tax rebate schemes introduced across the UK. First at Westminster with a particularly poorly targeted scheme. There's some statistics that we've run here. So the England scheme will see 2 million people lose out on support altogether. And it will benefit over 4 in 10 of those in the richest 10% of households. So really not kind of seeing support targeted where it's needed. We've seen devolved governments do better in terms of their schemes, and that's encouraging. But we know that the levels of support that are on offer aren't going far enough to meet the income shortfalls that households are going to be experiencing. We've also seen an increase in budgets for discretionary support. That's welcome and will be needed, but we know that discretionary support, that emergency kind of crisis grants, those kind of measures are really the end of the road. That's where everything else has failed, and that we're going to need to see much more kind of upstream to make sure that we don't see kind of more households falling into destitution or deepening poverty. And it's really important to note that what we saw in the spring statement was really shockingly inadequate in terms of the situation that we're looking towards. So we saw a decision not to increase the value of benefits in line with inflation. So for households that are in work, but in low paid work, or households particularly that are out of work due to caring, sickness, disability, or unemployment, not seeing any support at all to deal with these increasing bills and rising costs across the board. So we know that is going to have a direct effect of pulling people into poverty. We've done some analysis on what the support announced so far looks like. And we know that it's really falling very, very far short. So this is run after the spring statement, and it looks at kind of 3 just kind of illustrative households. So you imagine a kind of typical family in the poorest quintile, so the lowest 20% of households. And we see that a couple with 1 child are experiencing are likely to experience an income shortfall this year of £670. So that's based on whether their budget can stretch compared to what it would have been previously without these kind of inflationary pressures. And that's a budget that was obviously squeezed before, and we're now seeing an additional kind of pressure on that scale. And we're seeing this across the board. So really staggering shortfalls in terms of the hole that's going to appear in families' budgets, and indeed is already appearing. And finally, what does this mean for poverty? We know that it's going to pull people into deeper poverty and put them at greater risk of destitution in particular. People are going to be forced to choose between heating and eating. We're already seeing this, and I'm sure we'll have more time to discuss that this morning. We know that in technical terms, our key poverty measure, like relative poverty, actually doesn't give us the whole picture here. So if we see households dealing with rising costs, but their incomes are staying stable or kind of are unchanged, then we're not seeing the kind of the incredible hardship that's actually being endured in that picture. So we know that relative poverty as a measure isn't going to tell us the whole story here. And we also know the significant data issues, both through the pandemic and due to the data lags that exist, that mean that we won't have kind of headline figures describing the poverty impacts while this is being experienced this year. We do know, though, that some of the policy decisions taken already, particularly that decision not to operate. Oh, sorry. Not to operate benefits, has pulled 600,000 people, will pull 600,000 people into poverty this year. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers today.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks very much. The next speaker is Kate Cunningham, Communications and Public Affairs Manager at Energy Action Scotland, and she will focus particularly on the energy crisis, providing a specific focus on how this is manifested in Scotland. Kate.
Hi there, thank you very much. Can everybody see my screen? I'm not quite sure what you can see.
Yeah, we can see it.
Fantastic. It's a really interesting gathering today. My thanks to the Poverty Alliance for bringing us all together and for inviting Energy Action Scotland to speak. I know that today I'm speaking to people who understand and share our concerns, but I'm struck by the likelihood that most, if not all of us, will also be affected by the issues that we're discussing. The current and forthcoming energy price cap rises mean that we're facing a threat to many lives this winter. Fuel poverty levels in Scotland have changed very little over the past 10 plus years and directly result in 6 deaths every day of winter. One wonders what level of investment government might muster if a road in Scotland resulted in deaths at a similar level. The last house conditions survey in Scotland in 2019 stated that 613,000 households, that's 24.6% of households in Scotland, were fuel poor. And to give that a UK context, Northern Ireland was estimated in 2018 to have 131,000 households, or 18% of households in fuel poverty. Wales, again in 2018, estimated at 155,000, or 12% of households. And England was estimated to have around 2.4 million, or 10.3% of households in fuel poverty. Sorry, it skips. In February 2022, Kate Forbes told the Scottish Parliament that Scottish Government analysts had determined that the increase in the capped standard variable rate for dual fuel households and wider changes in energy pricing would increase fuel poverty in Scotland by 43%, meaning that 36% of households would be in fuel poverty, with almost 600,000 households in extreme fuel poverty. Households in rural Scotland are doubly penalised by higher costs. Many of these households pay almost double the average UK dual fuel bill because they live off the gas grid and are dependent on electricity and perhaps also on solid fuel. They also suffer from an apportionment of transmission costs, which further inflate costs versus other parts of the UK. A legacy of when these areas were remote from the centres of power generation, yet these very same areas are now the powerhouse of our renewables sector. Even daily standing charges further disadvantage households in Scotland over other GB households. The highest standing charges for electricity are found in Scotland, while the lowest are in London. Now this diagram, which I'm afraid is a little bit blurry, was produced by the Fuel Bank Foundation and shows that as prices rise, the effect is acute amongst prepayment households. Their energy costs are not spread evenly over 12 months as direct debit customers experience. In real cash terms, to achieve the same level of thermal comfort, prepayment households in the coldest months face incredibly high cash requirements. We believe that this is more likely, it's more likely that these houses will go without, self-disconnecting from supply. It reduces consumption and reduces carbon, but also reduces health, well-being and outcomes. It's the sort of reductions that should shame Scotland. A recent training event for frontline workers working with people in challenge.
Kate, your slides aren't moving.
No, I'm about to move on to the next one, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, a recent training event for frontline workers working with people in challenging circumstances and provided very real insight into the coping mechanisms that desperate households deploy. A sample of these quotes from advisors I have on slides, which I'm happy to share after today, but they'll appear on screen shortly. So the much delayed fuel poverty strategy was finally published in December after 3 years wait, and offers very little in the way of optimism really. Scotland has statutory targets to all but eliminate fuel poverty by 2040, even before the current market turmoil. It was unclear how those targets were in any way achievable, with £33 billion of investment required. So my apologies to those of you who've heard me say this many times in the past, but we know what the problems are. We've consulted on them, we've debated them, workshopped them, and collated them into dozens of sponsored publications. But we need action, and we need it in the next 6 months if we're going to have any impact on those most at risk. We need to work with communities and households to identify and prioritise those in the greatest need and who would benefit from rapid interventions. We pay lip service to lived experience, but it should be informing our planning. One contractor talks about retrofitting a terrace of houses and returning to find that the outer cladding had been punctured by hanging baskets and Christmas lights. But where was the conversation there? Would we treat homeowners the way we treat tenants? And I'll leave that question hanging right there, I think. The estimated bill to retrofit our old and neglecting housing stock is simply staggering. But how will many homeowners, many of whom are in fuel poverty, how will they afford the required investment? We haven't even begun the job of engaging them, and instead hear that to reduce our energy consumption and achieve our net zero targets, we just must. That rhetoric may play well in the corridors of power, but it's not capturing hearts and minds of the people in the Western Isles, given the scale of hardship and the change required. What if we replace just must rhetoric with legislation that stops property developers building acre upon acre of new homes with thousands of exactly the same gas boilers that we must replace? We could and should be building homes to passive house standards instead of sentencing future generations to the same hardships that hundreds of thousands face right now. We could have been doing this for years in line with so many other countries, but we chose not to. Face-to-face support must be helped to support those who need it most, not those most able to mobilise and engage with services. Many small organisations and charities are themselves struggling with energy bills to keep services running, and we must tackle this now. EAS are currently working with partners to get cold weather emergency supplies to households across Scotland before next winter.
Are you nearly finished? I'm sorry, Kate. But
yes, I am. Sorry, I'm just closing now. Sorry. Tinfoil, radiator reflectors, duvets and flasks to try and stop people freezing to death in their own homes. Let me end by sharing the words of someone who has clearly walked this road. Those who have can always argue that tomorrow is time enough.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Kate. Moving on now to Neris Sheehan, Senior Development Officer at Caerau and APLE, alongside Stefan Evans, Head of Policy from the Bevan Foundation, and they'll look at the impact in Wales. And if I could just remind people, if you could try and keep it to 5 minutes, that would be helpful because we're already running over time. Thanks.
Stefan.
So I've done so. It's Neris and Stefan next.
I don't think we can hear you, Stefan.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, let's thank you very much for allowing us to join this morning. I am Stefan Evans, and I'm from the Bevan Foundation. So for those of you from outside of Wales who are unfamiliar with us, we're a Welsh think tank looking for long-term solutions to poverty and inequality. So I'll be speaking quickly first, and then I'll hand over to Neris. So just to provide just a really quick context, overview of the context in Wales. We did some research with UCA back in November 2021. I found that 39% of Welsh households didn't have enough money for anything beyond the basics, and that was a deterioration that was 6% worse than when we ran the same survey in May last year. So the situation was already getting worse before these recent cost hikes. And of those 39%, 165,000 households either sometimes or always struggle to afford the basics. And to put that into a context, that's more than the number of households we have in Cardiff. So really, really large numbers of people were really struggling already. And what that means is that 1 in 3 were cutting back on their utilities before the most recent rises, a quarter were cutting back on food, and a quarter were borrowing money to cover their essentials. So, it was a very grim picture before we got to the most recent price hikes. But I'll hand over to Nerys, who's able to talk maybe a bit more about what's going on in a particular community in Wales, and also about the great work that Action and Caerau and APLE are doing as well.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for having me here. It's been really interesting listening to some of the experiences across the UK, and it'll be no surprise ours is not too dissimilar down here too. So as Stefan mentioned, I work in the communities of APLE and Caerau, 2 of the most deprived wards in Wales, predominantly council estates. Fantastic community, amazing community spirit, but people are really struggling here. Our centre serves to support people in, to build on their communities, instill resilience in them, and also be here as a practical place of help and support. Since November, we have had to refocus our efforts and launch what we've called a crisis hour. The purpose for that being is once the £20 universal credit uplift was removed, we saw families in significant hardship. We try and work on a community development approach and build on assets and try and instill resilience and community-led initiatives that are going to support people in a way that's meaningful for them. One of those things that we've done is set up our community pantry, which is to try and help alleviate food poverty and increase, reduce food insecurity. And provide a longer term sustainable solution to food poverty. What we saw from November is that people, our regular customers, members who were coming along, we wouldn't see them for a little while. When they did eventually come back in, we discovered that the reason they weren't coming along is because they simply couldn't afford the £5 membership fee to pay for their food. And that was pretty shocking for us, because if they can't afford that, what are they doing for food? So we launched the crisis hour. The crisis hour runs between 9 and 10 every morning, and we support people with food vouchers, emergency food parcels, and also fuel vouchers. Now, the demand for this service has increased tenfold, and just to give you some context, in March we issued 77 fuel vouchers to the low-income households who were at risk of self-disconnecting. We're on the 26th of April and we've already issued 98 so far, so it is increasing massively, and I don't think that we're really seeing the full effects of this yet. I'm really concerned that there's so many families out there who are going without. I think the situation is only going to get worse in the winter, and we are going to see a number of excess winter fuel deaths. Charities like ourselves, we're here, we want to help, but I also feel that we are picking up a lot of the slack because of policy decisions that are not meeting the needs of people who actually need the help. And every bit of support is welcome, but often it doesn't go far enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you both for keeping to time, even though there were 2 of you. Exemplary. Next speaker is Johnny Curry, Northern Ireland Network lead from Trussell Trust, who will be discussing the crisis from the perspective of Northern Ireland, and in particular in relation to food insecurity.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Johnny Curry. I work for the Trussell Trust. We're an anti-poverty organisation that supports a network of food banks across the UK. I'm in Northern Ireland lead, so I'm going to be spending the next 4.5 minutes speaking about the perspective in Northern Ireland. So at a glance, and again, a lot of these statistics are pre-pandemic, so we're waiting for a clearer post-pandemic picture of things here, but there are nearly 1 in 5 people in poverty here pre-pandemic, which includes over 100,000 children out of a total population of 1,860,000. Roughly 1 in 14 households here live in food insecurity based on stats in 2019. However, there was a slightly larger percentage of households deemed to have marginal food insecurity, so it'd be interesting to see post-pandemic and now that we're in a whole new world of cost of living crisis, how those families have been tipped into greater food insecurity. 1/3 of the population here live in rural areas, 2/3 live in urban areas. The majority of the most deprived areas are in the urban parts of Northern Ireland. And there's also evidence of a growing east-west divide in Northern Ireland, which will be a bit more clear on my next slide when I show you the map of where our food banks are based. Recent research that was produced by the National Institute UK Economic Outlook in February projected that Northern Ireland faces a much higher rate of destitution than many other parts of the UK. It projected that every UK region was projected to have more than a 10% increase, but in Northern Ireland we were projected to have a 67% increase. Back in 2016, it was revealed that 22% of households in Northern Ireland were living in fuel poverty, and that was sort of scaled up in 2018 to show that had gone down in 2 years' time to 18%, which was a stat that was mentioned earlier. Again, be able to see what the post-pandemic stats will be in relation to that. And here the legacy of the conflict impacts on poverty as well. And I'll mention that slightly later on. This is where our food banks are based. We support 21 food banks and then a further 20 distribution centres. They're mostly concentrated in the eastern part of Northern Ireland. We also have a very vibrant network of independent food aid providers also. In terms of our mid-year statistics for last year, we distributed over 25,000 3-day emergency food supplies, which was a 40% increase in Northern Ireland compared with stats pre-pandemic, and an 11% increase. That's compared to 11% increase UK wide. So our parcel stats for Northern Ireland have been considerably amongst the highest in the UK, which is alongside our poverty levels, as revealed in the recent Joseph Rowntree research report for Northern Ireland, aren't quite as high as the rest of the UK. So there's an interesting story there that needs to be delved into. But just broadly, some of the key considerations for Northern Ireland. This is my final slide. I talked there about the levels of food insecurity here, the challenge that they have in terms of deprivation, the rising tide of destitution. Health and well-being is a major issue as well. The differential between the most advantaged areas and the least disadvantaged areas in terms of life expectancy is on the rise again. More people have taken their own lives through suicide since the Good Friday Agreement that were actually killed in political violence during the Troubles, and yet we have the lowest levels of mental health spend in the UK and Ireland. From a policy perspective, we're still waiting on an anti-poverty strategy to be approved by the Northern Ireland Executive. It was one of the key components of the New Decade New Approach package, which was part of the sort of suite around getting Stormont up and running again back in 2018. So in terms of policy direction, that's a real gap here and a real upstream piece of legislation and strategy that's needed. Research areas, we have a number of social supermarkets in Northern Ireland, similar to a pantry model in other parts of the UK, that are directly funded by Stormont here. But there's a lack of research around whether they are actually reducing the need for emergency food. We have ongoing inter and intra community issues here, just in terms of the influence, in terms of legacy of the conflict and the role of paramilitarism, and just how that's holding communities back, especially where we have the highest parcel use is largely in those communities. We also have political uncertainty here. It's one of our strongest exports. In spite of Brexit and the protocols, it's pretty much a constant here, which has a knock-on effect on, for example, an anti-poverty strategy being fully implemented here. And just the final point is, we're the smallest part of the Trussell Trust network across the UK. We're only 5%, but we have among the highest percentage increases in food parcel use compared to all the other regions of the UK. So a similar picture broadly, of just a few quite unique NI specific nuances and considerations.
Great, thank you very much, Johnny. Next speaker is Dan Oliver, speaking on behalf of the APLE Collective. APLE standing for Addressing Poverty with Lived Experience. So I'm really pleased that you're able to be here, Dan, because it's very important that we hear directly from someone with lived experience. And I think you're going to talk about the digital divide and its role in this current crisis. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you everyone for having us here this morning. Yes, I'm Dan. I lead a team of community organisers at a social enterprise called Starting Point in Stockport, in a community that ranks in some of the most deprived indices nationally. And as well as running our community coffee shop, we are the lead provider for our local Digital Inclusion Alliance, which led us to joining the APLE Collective with a particular digital divide focus. We joined APLE last year. As Ruth said, APLE stands for Addressing Poverty with Lived Experience. It's a national network set up in 2018 for people and organisations who have either experienced or are experiencing poverty. And we've got members ranging from being in Stoke, Greater Manchester, Hartlepool in the northeast of England, Glasgow, Surrey, and more. Our aim is to raise awareness of poverty, reduce stigma, and work with others to eradicate it, with cooperation being at the heart of what we do. We promote the voices of those with lived experience of poverty, regularly writing blogs, engaging with media opportunities, APPG events like this one, and in the last few months, published Socially Distanced Activism, our launch event with Brandon Lister. And each year, one of our key focuses is IDEP, the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, which is a UN initiative on the 17th of October. Very much about, again, sharing stories, promoting the voices of those with lived experience, and looking at how we create change. It was during COVID that we decided to focus on the Digital Divide campaign. Obviously, we all know that the world is moving online at an ever-increasing rate. COVID placed a greater focus on it than ever before. And at the heart of it is internet access, having suitable devices, and having digital literacy and the digital skills that many of us can take for granted, but for others can mean they're shut out of services and support networks. We see it on a daily basis in terms of the people we engage with. It affects us as a staff team, as an organisation led by lived experience. And yeah, I suppose our key focus in coming to events like this is when food and energy are becoming more expensive as a result of the cost of living crisis. You know, our worry is that digital access becomes a nice to have rather than a need to have, or is seen in that way, when in essence it is an essential part of our modern life nowadays. And these issues are interlinked. If you can't afford electricity, then you can't access your broadband, you can't charge your devices. So they are heavily interlinked in terms of the cost of living crisis. So our key campaign ask is for decision makers, power holders to work in partnership with us and people with lived experience to create change, you know, to make sure nobody's left behind, disconnected, unable to participate in modern life. Our headline ask is free Wi-Fi for low-income families, because we think it is a very valuable part of what we need to be doing going forwards. And as part of our campaign efforts, we've engaged with MPs and decision makers. We've led public events and webinars, contributed to media efforts, published blogs, like I mentioned, and that led us to being awarded the Digital Campaigner of the Year award last year with the Parliament Awards. But it's also given us significant opportunities to influence change. We were part of the National Operation Wi-Fi campaign that last year delivered the National Data Bank that now has Virgin Media O2, 3 and Vodafone all involved, which in essence runs very similar to a food bank model where people can access internet data in times of crisis, just to help as a short-term solution while we look at the fact that a spectrum of solutions is needed for an issue like this. We're also working quite closely with Good Things Foundation, the National Digital Exclusion Charity, on their Data Poverty Lab, designing solutions in partnership with people with lived experience. That's led us to run a series of workshops the last few months. The report is due out this week with the outcomes of those, but identifies cost as the single most important issue for a solution to digital exclusion, recognises that no one size fits all and that spectrum of solutions is needed. So we're going to continue working with the Good Things Foundation. And then over the summer, we're going to be doing some work as an APLE collective with the Ada Lovelace Institute around how big data systems affect health and wellbeing outcomes for those living in poverty. A national listening campaign that again will result in recommendations. And I suppose the key thing that we want to share while we're here today is at the heart of our direction and all of our activities are real stories. You know, stories that are powerful, personal. They show the real impact of these issues that statistics alone can struggle to show. You know, on a daily basis, we engage with families who are having to choose between food, energy, internet access. You know, we met families recently in Stockport where one child didn't have a bed. The mum had a cup of tea for her evening meal 3 days on the run, so the kids could eat instead. You know, these are the real life impacts of these issues. Again, families homeschooling during COVID lockdowns, having a greater reliance on digital means than ever before, yet only having one device between multiple children. People struggle to look for work or access benefits if they don't have the data or devices or the skills they need. And it affects every part of life, doesn't it? You know, again, both from our experience, the stories we hear, research shows that those on lower incomes and living in poverty are less likely to have digital skills, and so are more at risk of being victims of online scams and fraud. It can affect health and wellbeing outcomes. We've got one of our members in Glasgow who was recently expected to print their own labels for a blood test sample, you know, with the expectation being that they could afford a printer, they already had one, they could afford the ink, and yet they didn't have any of those things, and there was no alternative given. You know, so they might be very small and very specific issues, but these are the things that make a difference in people's daily lives, and they're things that we hear through listening and making sure that these people are involved and sat at the table when these discussions are being had and decisions are being made. So yeah, throughout all of this, our message is hopefully quite clear. People should not have to choose between basic necessities that we all need in modern life. So the opportunity to do something about these issues is still here. I've really enjoyed listening to everybody else so far. And these issues are so interlinked, you know, that it's brilliant to see events like this taking place. And all I would ask to finish is you're more than welcome. Please do follow us on Twitter as the APLE Collective, or check out our website. We have APLE Month coming up in June, where we're launching a new podcast and with a particular focus on digital exclusion and spotlighting other organisations. And other than that, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you. And last but not least, Sabine Goodwin, who is the coordinator at the Independent Food Aid Network, and she'll give an overview about the increased reliance on food banks. We've heard a bit about that in the context of Northern Ireland, but this will be, I think, a UK-wide look at the issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really good to be here, and thanks for having me. And excellent to hear from all the other speakers. I'm Sabine. I'm the coordinator of what's called the Independent Food Aid Network, and we represent food aid providers operating across all 4 nations, including well over 550 independent food banks. Our vision is of a society without the need for charitable food aid, where adequate and nutritious food is affordable to all. We're calling for a cash-first approach to food insecurity that will ensure the root causes of poverty, driving the need for food banks and charitable food aid, are addressed for the long term. We've recently written to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor calling for immediate action to reduce the rapidly rising levels of poverty and destitution and hunger in our communities. The scale of the crisis that our members are seeing is unprecedented. I quote from our letter: "We are deeply concerned about the scale of suffering that we are already witnessing, as well as our capacity to prevent people from going hungry in the weeks and months to come. The challenges that food aid providers in our network are facing in their efforts to support increasing levels of need are often extreme. Our members are using reserves to pay for food and are impacted by food and energy price increases as they try to keep their often fragile operations afloat, as Kate referred to. Volunteers and food bank workers are often exhausted, and teams are reporting that they are running on empty. At one of our regular members' meetings yesterday, food bank managers spoke of the physical and emotional impact that this crisis without end, seemingly without end apparently, is having on them and their colleagues. And I'll quote from our letter representing the voices of food bank managers across the UK. It is not for volunteers to plug the gaps left by a broken social security system and poorly paid jobs. Over the last 12 years, our members have worked tirelessly and often extremely challenging circumstances to support hundreds of thousands of people in communities across the UK. However, there is a limit to food banks' capacities to support the numbers of people seeking their help. Food bank teams are often overstretched and exhausted and could well be unable to continue to pick up the pieces. Volunteers cannot be expected to cope both physically and mentally with such relentless demand. What's more, people used to donate to food banks are now needing to access help themselves. Our members are struggling to find the resources to provide adequate food parcels as the scale of demand and food and energy price increases impact on the services they run. It's important to note that our members were seeing a food insecurity crisis in their communities well before the pandemic began. The DWP's own food insecurity data show that 43% of households on universal credit were food insecure in the year prior to April 2020. Following the immediate spike in demand at the start of the pandemic, our members have been seeing rapidly rising levels of needs since the cut to universal credit, the end of the furlough scheme, and the start of this cost of living crisis. And food bank data, whether via the Trussell Trust or IFAN, is the tip of the iceberg. Recent Food Standards Agency data show that 4% of people in England, Wales and Northern Ireland are used a food bank in the 12 months up to June 2021, with 15% of people going hungry or reducing their food intake due to lack of income. Again, I quote from our letter, an emergency supply of food cannot resolve someone's financial crisis and will act only as a temporary sticking plaster. Measures must be urgently introduced to decisively increase people's incomes through the social security system, emergency cash first support, and wage increases combined with job security. IFAN is calling for the UK and national governments to urgently introduce measures that will ensure cash first, income-based solutions to growing poverty and food insecurity. Benefits must be uprated in line with inflation. The 5-week wait for universal credit, the benefit cap, the 2-child limit, the sanction system, and no recourse to public fund status must be removed. Wages should match the cost of living and job security must be ensured. And crisis payments in the form of cash must be available, easily accessible and well promoted in every local authority in the UK. Charitable food aid has been an inadequate and unsustainable stopgap measure to growing poverty in the UK for 12 years now. By now, food banks and other food aid providers are reaching breaking point. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Sabine. It's an important point to end on, or that the charities can't be, I mean, what is worrying is the way that charitable support has been normalised and almost treated as now part of the welfare state. And while it's doing a really important job, it cannot be an alternative to effective government action to improve incomes. Anyway, thank you all of you. I think we've got a very good picture of different parts of the United Kingdom, various aspects brought to light, highlighted of the cost of living crisis. I will now pass over to Eleanor Whittam, NSP, who will chair the question and answer session. And I'm sorry we've slightly overrun our time, but I think there's still plenty of time for questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Ruth, and thank you to all of the panelists that we've had this morning. I think the discussion has been wide-ranging and certainly eye-opening for those that maybe haven't had their eyes open to the reality of what we're facing yet. I think it's set out today very starkly. My role within the Scottish Parliament here is convener of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee, and we have a sharp focus on poverty and inequality. And as we see this crisis deepening and emerging, we're actually having to rethink our own work programme as to how best we can scrutinise the government in terms of the actions being taken here. We do have some questions in the question and answer box, so I'm going to kick off there. There are some further ones in the chat, so I'm going to try and make sure that I can keep my eye on both of them. Some of them are directed at specific people, but what I might do, if there's nobody listed in the question, I'll direct it to a panelist in the first instance. So the first question we have is actually from Paul, and Paul's asking about the council tax rebate scheme. So he's interested to understand whether the schemes are tapered and whether they're integrated in any other way with other tapered schemes. or are they adding to the poverty trap? Now, this is a really interesting question. Now, obviously in Scotland, we have council tax reduction scheme, which is slightly different, but I'm not so sure who to kick this off with, and I'm going to call on Rachel from the IPPR. I don't know if maybe you could kick us off, Rachel?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Eleanor. So the short answer is no, they're not tapered. It's £100 flat payment that's going to households in those council tax bands, A to D in the first instance, and then people in receipt of council tax reduction schemes in Scotland, and then I think it's a similar one in Wales, but Stefan, you can keep us right on that one, and similarly on Northern Ireland from Northern Ireland specialists. So it's a flat payment and it's not tapered, but it is in some cases there's eligibility based on a tapered rate, in the council tax reduction schemes, kind of taper down in terms of how much of your council tax bill is reduced.
Do you think, Rachel, just before I bring anybody else in on that, do you think it's actually adding to the issues with relating to poverty? The way that these policies are set up, is it exacerbating the issue?
I don't know if it's going as far as exacerbating, but I think there's definitely, it's a kind of it's a difficult kind of administrative response to a much bigger problem. A one-off payment is not to be sniffed at in a crisis of the scale that we're experiencing, but it's definitely not adequate to respond to those income shortfalls that families are facing, not just 1 month but month after month. And so while we need to see, while it's useful the governments are doing something to get cash into families' pockets, and the cash first response is obviously what we need to deal with, what is a crisis of inadequate incomes in light of rapidly rising costs. We know that the kind of measures that have been announced barely touch the sides of the income gaps people are facing week on week and month on month.
Thanks very much for that, Rachel. I do see nodding heads from Dan and Stefan and Neris and everybody else. I'm assuming that they agree with what you've set out there for us. The second question we have comes from Suzanne. Suzanne's asking, what do we think our respective nations... Oh, and another question came in, so I need to scroll back up. What do we think our respective nations could learn from each other, and are there common themes? And I definitely think that we do have common themes. There's definitely some different approaches and some divergence that's happening across the nations. But we've heard today from panelists from different areas. I wonder if anybody wants to come in on that. I don't know whether, Johnny, from a Northern Ireland perspective, you kind of clearly set out where your levels of poverty and your, the reliance on food banks is disproportionately higher than the rest of the UK. I don't know if you want to explore that a little bit more and say maybe where there's some learning from other nations that you think you can make use of there, or what you could export to other nations. Thanks.
Thanks, Elena. Yeah, so we do have a bit of a data gap in Northern Ireland that we're hoping to address this year. The latest research project, where previously we didn't have enough of a sample size for Northern Ireland. It was just to sort of get really to the heart of what the drivers of food bank use are here. We have a sense that it's in work poverty and it's in rural areas. We just need the data to back that up. Something that we are keen to build we're keen to build and ask for within Northern Ireland is for a child poverty payment similar to Scotland. Learning what has worked well, how to ask that, how to message it appropriately, because we find that there's a resonance in the £20 payment from the really strong support that there was across really civic society here for the maintenance of the £20 uplift for universal credit. We found that there was a real, almost like a crossing over into the mainstream in terms of that being seen as something that was fundamentally unjust. So we see that's something that we can build on, but very much based on learning, especially from Scotland, in terms of how that payment process is rolled out.
Thanks very much for that, Johnny. And it's very interesting as well to hear that data is the key driver, and I think data, really robust and strong data, is what will help us to make key policy decisions right across the piece. And also happy for us to share any learning that we can provide with regards to the child payment and how that is working out. Obviously, there's issues in the long term with regards to whether if it's increased beyond a certain level, what happens to universal credit, eligibility, etc., etc. So lots to consider going forward. I don't know if Stefan or Neris, you want to say anything briefly from your perspective, Stefan?
Yeah, I guess from the Welsh perspective, I think what we've seen in Wales, and kind of a common theme from what we've been hearing from everyone, is there has been a massive step up in terms of this temporary support that's kind of available. And I think that's particularly interesting in the Welsh context, where Welsh government have historically been, the conversation with is social security powers have not been devolved, and therefore the conversation ends dead there. Whereas we've seen the provision of cash directly to families for the first time, kind of as a response to this pandemic. So there might be some interesting spaces there about what that means in future for policy, but it's also created new problems, which I'm sure Neris could attest to, about loads of different application forms, because these are all standalone schemes, and it's kind of piece of work we've been doing for a long time, called about bringing these together into what we've done, a Welsh benefit system, because we know take up of the winter fuel payment, the kind of the new cash payment Welsh government did for households in fuel poverty, it was struggling to get to 50%, kind of before the deadline closed in the last one. So it's great to come up with the new payments, but if we don't have the systems to underpin them, then they're undermining kind of the effectiveness of what those schemes are trying to achieve. I don't know, Neris, if you've got kind of experience of trying to help people access some of those as well.
Yeah, and I was just reading through some of the comments, and Jenna's raised an interesting point about, the work the charities are doing. I've just come back off a week of annual leave. I am absolutely physically and mentally exhausted. It feels as though we're going through a constant hamster wheel cycle, and there doesn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel. I'm really concerned as what's going to happen come the winter months. Somebody mentioned about the families being cash poor at certain times of the year because of the increased cost. We're going to see that. How it concerns me further as to how organisations like ourselves are going to be sustained. We're grant dependent. If that money isn't available for people like us, what happens then? But again, I can't help but think that, if we are kind of making things a bit easier for the government and policies are not being put in place that are really addressing the root cause. And as Stefan said, we really do welcome the support that's being offered here in Wales, but I can't keep emphasising enough, it's not going far enough.
I think that's a real consideration for all the organisations out there on the ground. I volunteer in a community food larder and the village that I stay in, and I see already that volunteers there are just flat out exhausted, and we're only scraping the surface for what's to come. And I do take your point, and I think all the parliamentarians on this meeting need to reflect on decisions that are taken, whether those in the voluntary sector and communities are stepping into the breach in terms of the policies that are missing and things that have been decided that are having a big impact. So thanks very much, Neris, for actually vocalising that. I think it's important that we do have that recorded today. I've got a question as well from Bill that he directed to Kate, Kate's answered it in the chat, but it was roundabout. Kate saying that action was needed urgently, but what would be the most effective action the Scottish Government could take in the next 6 months? And Kate's answered, target financial help to those most in need. We have the ability to identify these households, and we also need to involve the NHS Scotland in conversations about supporting those with energy needs at home to support medical need and equipment. This is something I think all of us are really becoming alive to. The fact that rising energy costs means that some people will not be able to afford medical things at home that they maybe would need, or indeed if they're turning off their fuel, they might exacerbate underlying conditions that then lead them to require support from our medical services. I can see I've got hands up from Sabine and from Dan. I'll bring Sabine in first and then Dan.
Thanks, Elena. It was just to follow on in terms of data. I mean, vital to be charting the levels of food insecurity, because food bank data just really represents the tip of the iceberg, just to reiterate that point. And in terms of what you were just saying about how our members, as I've said, are absolutely at the end of the road, and that's the same for many organisations and communities across the UK. But we need to channel that sense of that we must be talking about that all the time, because there's a real danger here, isn't there, that this charitable system will be bolstered yet again, and what we really need to do is target support to people who will benefit from it directly, and we would reduce that pressure on charitable food aid provision. Otherwise we're going to be institutionalizing all of this even more. And I just wanted to say that the Scottish Government's work in terms of their plan for ending the need for food banks is something that really could be inspirational in other nations. There is a plan on the cards, and response has been brilliant, and many organisations have been involved in feeding back on that, and that there is so much to be learned from having a step-by-step plan that looks at and has a vision of ending the need for charitable food aid, and there's no reason why we can't keep on track with that with enough energy and commitment. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sabina. Just before I bring Dan in, it was interesting to see that we did start to reduce the requirement for food banks in Scotland, whilst the UC uplift was still in place. But we're seeing a reverse of that trend now, even despite some divergence in policy. So yeah, there's huge pressure still in place, but that's something we need to keep our eye on. Dan, bring you in.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to agree with other points made, and just add a kind of a comment about access as well in terms of the original question. I know from speaking to our other members in the Poverty Truth community in Glasgow, they speak very highly about how the Scottish Government has included people with lived experience in making decisions. And it doesn't just feel like a consultation. And I'm not sure how widespread that is in others. We've not got any Welsh members at the moment, so if there is anybody in Wales who would like to join the APLE collective, you're more than welcome. But yeah, I know that's definitely been mentioned, and I think, again, on the note of access, in terms of the reason why we want people with lived experience included in those decision-making processes is to try and get ahead of these issues. So we've had it recently where the food voucher schemes, we've had local authorities where take-up has been particularly low for those, and part of that has been emails have gone straight to people's junk email folders, and they haven't then known how to access them or whether to check it at all. So there are bits there about, if people were included in these discussions from the start, we might get ahead of these things first of all. And it's one of the key things when we were involved in the Operation Wi-Fi campaign in setting up the National Data Bank, was about access and eligibility and making it easy. And so there is now the data bank set up, and there's national telecoms providers involved. There's no criteria, there's no application form. It's all managed by trusted local providers. So people in those communities are trusted to identify and work with the people who need that support the most and to access the data, rather than it being a set eligibility or set requiring to use an online form. People can get that local support with someone that they've seen in the community already, or an organisation they already know.
Thanks very much for that, Dan. And I think your point about lived experience is really important. And I think the issue with lived experience is it can't just be a token thing. It has to actually embed itself in the decisions and the strategic vision that's taken, because people will get fatigued if they are consulted and used in a way that doesn't then translate into meaningful action at the other end of that. And we've got a question from Victoria, and it's round about households who are missing out on assistance. Now, this is a really important one that I've tried to champion when I was a deputy council leader, in terms of automatic awards for things. And if we think about how we can actually ensure that everybody has access to systems, whether that's forms, but what are the barriers, what are the problems? How do we make sure that we don't forget about people? Because it's one thing for governments to say, we know X people are missing out, but how do we actually reach them? So I'll bring Rachel in here, because we had the launch of the report just recently with yourselves, and automation was one of the ones, the issues that you brought up. So if I could bring you in first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a point that comes up again and again, but remains, critical. And I think progress has still been slow, although we have some really interesting kind of local examples of innovation. So Glasgow City Council in Scotland has obviously kind of trialled greater automation, looking at the kind of local payments are administered by local authorities. And we know because speaking of consultation fatigue, people in receipt of Social Security have told government and forums like this time and time again, the application forms make a massive difference. Having to declare the same information in multiple forms is both tiresome and stressful, and if thinking about the circumstances people are already having to deal with, it's another often unnecessary burden. So what we have been pushing for in terms of policy recommendations is data sharing agreements wherever possible. That's either between across local authorities, even within one local authority, sometimes where somebody has one part of the local authority will have information about housing arrangements, and then we've seen quite good progress at local authority level, but we need that now to connect into devolved government social security apparatus, and then also wherever possible across to UK government as well. So looking at where you can set up systems that are much more straightforward to navigate, that don't ask people for the same information multiple times, and that are accessible. So asking people, what way works for you in terms of whether you have a conversation with somebody face to face, online, on the phone, and making sure that those options are available.
Thanks for that, Rachel. I don't know if Dan, you've got anything you maybe want to add that in terms of, digital exclusion and just, your comments earlier about everything really is done online, and if you don't have access to that at the moment, you really are going to struggle. Even if a council's form is really streamlined in terms of free school meal applications and clothing grant, if you can't actually get access to that online service, that's going to be an issue. I don't know if you want to say something, and then Stefan, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really important point, isn't it, in terms of making sure that people can use it. And I think that again comes back to the point about making sure people are involved from the start. We're in Stockport, and Stockport Council at the moment are just about to start their consultation on a local plan, which will be online mapping software. But what they've started with, first of all, that we're working with them on is how could people use that system better? What should it look like? How should it be designed? So that when you get to the consultation phase or the inputs phase, you've already taken that feedback into account. And the same can be applied to any kind of form filling. It comes back to the same point again about the voluntary and community sector, doesn't it? In terms of as many of us start to struggle more, it becomes the easy option to put things online, and it becomes more efficient for our organisations, but it isn't necessarily the best way for the people we're trying to reach.
Thanks very much. And Stefan?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with everything everyone said so far. I guess there's also kind of IT systems kind of invested into that. That's always kind of, is a computer says no approach. Well, actually, we can just redesign the software. Is kind of very much the change of that mindset. And the other thing I think it's worth thinking about as well is that one of the big issues that's come up during the pandemic is that a lot of these new schemes are administered by local authorities. But a lot of those revs and bends teams have been cut back to the bone, especially with housing benefit being pulled into universal credit. So a lot of the staff that used to do this work no longer are in post, and therefore there's fewer staff are now doing a lot more activity. So, if we kind of make that commitment longer term around some of these extra schemes, or kind of thinking about how we make the systems easier, then we can increase the staff capacity as well, because that's often kind of holding back our ability to kind of more proactively engage with people as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one, and I do think that we have some, reduction in certain areas within councils right across the whole of the UK in terms of cost pressures. But when they are directly impacting on some of the things that we need them to deliver now, if you all of a sudden don't have those staff in place, and whether that was getting pandemic payments out, all of those different things that we saw, these members of staff really come into their own. Or in Scotland, they're probably administering the Scottish Welfare Fund as well, and so we do rely on these members of council staff massively. We've got a question from Neil in the chat round about what additional government action at UK level, but also at a devolved level, do the panelists think we need to see in the next 3, 6, 12 months? And what's that going to look like in terms of levels of hardship across the country? And I would like to start with Kate from a kind of a fuel poverty perspective on that, if I can. And I know that's probably a big question, 3, 6 and 12 months, but even if you could just think about in the immediate term, what action do we need?
I think we really need to see Westminster government creating windfall taxes on energy company profits. The levels of profit that we're seeing are unacceptable, given what given the ramifications for us all, actually, for for human life, for the NHS. We need more money in the system, and we need to target it at those most in need. The broad strokes help, has an impact because everybody's going to feel it at some level, but it has to go to the households most in need.
Absolutely, I agree with the sentiments there, Kate. Anybody else have any thoughts where perhaps their devolved area or the UK government can take an immediate action that would actually see another positive outcome? Sabine?
Well, absolutely, uprating benefits in line with inflation. I mean, it's the #1 bare minimum action that they can take that will make a huge difference. It's just obvious, isn't it? And anything that national governments can do to increase incomes directly for people, it is what's going to set the precedent for tackling this in the long term.
Thank you, absolutely, thank you. You've hit the nail on the head there. There is a comment that's kind of in the chat, but in the Q&A box as well, and it's round about the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, and it's from Yvonne, and it's round about how harrowing it was to read of the experiences of those with disabilities and people who are caring for them, and they're most likely to be kept in poverty. And it's really around a lot of those legacy benefits. They're often ignored by government when there's quite a reliance on focusing on universal credit. And I don't know if anybody on the panel can maybe speak to that, but I think it was just important to actually mention that here today, because there are a lot of people who find themselves on those legacy benefits and sometimes not eligible for assistance that other people might find themselves eligible for. But I'm just going to put it out there because I think it was quite an important one to mention. So if I don't see any hands going up but nodding heads, I'll move on to the next one, and I can see one from Tom, and this is one that previously in work that I did as a welfare rights advisor I found all the time was round about historical overpayments. So people being pushed further into debt, having money taken off their benefits, the money that we already say is the minimum that somebody needs to live on, being chased for historical overpayments, and it can go back years and decades. And sometimes they only get flagged when people now are switching to UC. They've maybe been in work for years, maybe find themselves back in a situation of having to claim, and then all of a sudden they're finding themselves with a really reduced entitlement because of these overpayments. Does anybody on the panel have any idea of what could be done to support people that maybe find themselves in that situation? Because obviously they're going to have another reliance on food banks for food, parcels and fuel. Not seeing any hands up. Do we think that that's something that we need decision makers to go away and think about? Stefan?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it, yes, is the answer to your question there. I think it just made me think about kind of debt as well, kind of links into this kind of more broadly. We know that the debt that a lot of people owe is actually to the public sector. Council tax debt in Wales increased fourfold over the course of the pandemic. So, are we seriously, as the public sector, going to be going after people for that debt at a time when they're not able to afford things anyway? And often what we'll find is that people who are in that debt actually shouldn't be paying it at all, because they should be eligible for the council tax reduction scheme in the first place. So I think there's far more that we could do as a public sector, so that we don't pursue people for debt, where sometimes actually do we use it to view can we write that off? Should people have been paying it anyway? And we don't resort to taking people to court as the first port of action, but rather actually doing that benefit eligibility checkups and all of that sort of stuff as well. I think there's scope to do far more there.
Thanks very much for that. Stefan, we've got a question again from Neil. I know there's lots of stuff in the chat, so I'll try and fill that in when I can do. Neil's got an interesting one, and it's about, do we need a UK-wide cross-governmental anti-poverty strategy in response to the surging cost of living? And if so, how can we make that happen given the obvious political challenges? Now, take the politicians out of this at the moment, but from yourselves as organisations out there working at the coalface, so to speak, do you think that we really need a UK-wide anti-poverty strategy that's actually going to go across all spheres of governments that we have. I'm seeing nodding heads. Oh, I can see a hand up. Okay, Dan, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, isn't it? You know, and I think it would need to bring in everything that's already been mentioned, you know, in terms of benefits uplifting. You know, it brings in other campaigns that are out there in terms of community wealth fund, properly investing in communities, you know, and I think that conversation is definitely needed as a collective. You know, I think we can often sometimes fall into that trap, can't we? Talking about food poverty, data poverty, you know, we do exactly the same, but at the heart of it, it is poverty, you know, and that is the core of it. It's people not having enough money coming into a household, you know, and we get frustrated sometimes when we end up in meetings and the sole focus is budgeting and people not being able to budget properly. And you just think, you know, the core issue here is people not getting enough money into their household, not whether they can budget. You know, it might be a factor for many, but the key issue here is people having enough money coming in the first place that can allow them to do and have a decent standard of life, not just a minimum. So yeah, and in terms of how we make it happen, I think it's pressure from all of us. I think community pressure needs to build for it. I think the more people that are asking for it, the more it will be likely to happen. I understand what Neil means in terms of political challenges. But yeah, I think the more we can talk about it, the more we call for it, the more organisations and people and communities we get on board, the more likely it is that it will happen.
Thank you. And Rachel, you want to come in? And then Johnny.
I'd absolutely echo everything that's been said. I think what's important for us as a kind of a range of different organisations working in this space now is to think about where there is an opportunity to have a kind of bigger and more expansive conversation about what our social safety net should look like, the role that it should be playing that it's obviously currently not fulfilling. And what it means for, you know, what the next, you know, decade of social security policy looks like in this country. And a lot of that obviously does still lie with the UK government, as much as devolved governments have kind of shown more political will to tackle the problem head on. And for us, the start of that conversation is about the level at which benefits are set and making sure, as Dan was just arguing, that those levels actually reflect the cost of living, where we know that currently they're really falling far short of doing that job.
Thanks for that, Rachel. Johnny?
We have assembly elections in 2 weeks' time here to Stormont, where we're electing MLAs again for a new term. It's uncertain as to whether a functioning executive will be in place. So that's not the case. We need to go UK-wide and go to our MPs and ask the anti-poverty strategy to be implemented UK-wide, because we can't go without that wider strategic focus here in Northern Ireland. So absolutely agree.
Absolutely, and I can understand from your perspective on that why that would be vital. And let's hope for a better outcome in terms of the elections. And Sabine, did you have your hand up to come in on that?
I did, just really quickly, just to echo Dan's point around disaggregating poverty and calling it food poverty, bed poverty, furniture poverty. It is all poverty, and we'd really welcome a UK-wide anti-poverty strategy that involves national governments, and we just focus on not just the cost of living crisis, but the entrenched poverty that's been getting worse and worse over more than a decade now. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think you're right, poverty is poverty, and if you're living in poverty, you've got poverty related to every aspect of you know, your existence at that point in time. There's an interesting question from James with regards to statutory reporting on local social welfare fund allocation across the 4 nations. And I do know in Scotland we do have that information, and it can sometimes show up where local authorities are doing different things. And I think that localism and that decision making at local area sometimes does have a big impact as well. It's not just the national decision making, but it sometimes is decisions that are taken at a local level. I would hazard a guess that it would be helpful and beneficial right across the UK for local social welfare fund allocations, that information to be published. I won't really bring anybody in it, because I just think that it leads back to that whole data and the data gaps that we see, and if we don't actually really understand what's happening, that we can't make the best decisions. Eddie's got an interesting comment round about food larders or pantries. And as I said previously, during the height of the pandemic, we set one up in my local village that's still running. But he does make the point about There's a lack of supply, and this is due to the increasing numbers of apps selling or distributing food surplus. This is affecting the sustainability. And how can we see areas centralise and share surplus better to help sustainability, improve the distribution from fair share suppliers? And I'll relate that back to the decision we took in East Ayrshire Council, was that the council actually led and paid the fair share subscription. We collected all the data and then we linked in with all of the food larders across the local authority area and made sure that we could give everybody an equal access to the food that was out there. And I'm not so sure if that happens in other areas. I don't know whether, Sabine, you've got anything that you want to say on that aspect?
I have just, we have to be really careful about the notion that surplus food is a solution to food poverty, because absolutely it's helpful in the here and now, but we need to really disentangle this notion that food surplus redistribution can be an answer here. Really we need to reduce the levels of food surplus and reduce the levels of food poverty, and that means reducing poverty, as we said. And where we've seen in the autumn where surplus food supply was compromised, it had an immediate impact on the ways that our members could support people, and it just proves, that proved at the time how unsustainable that way of going about things. And there is a limit to surplus food in the chain, as there is the limit to capacity of food banks and food aid providers to cope with this level of need. Cash is an answer always. Yeah, thank you.
I would agree with that, and I think that food surplus we should get to a point where it's a rare occurrence, and I think that we're not at that point yet. So to over rely on it in terms of how we deliver food security is absolutely not the right way to go. So take your point on that. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything with regards to that question. No, I'm going to move on. We've got one from Alison Humes. There are clearly established links between child poverty and being involved with social services or entering state care. Wales has the highest rate of looked after children in the UK, and policies directed at reducing these numbers. How is this achievable with all that we've heard this morning? I think that's a really big question, and I don't know if anybody right now has any initial thinking on that one. Stefan?
Yeah, I guess it feeds back into maybe the previous chat about kind of thinking about pan-UK stuff as well, doesn't it? So there's been a tendency in Wales for us to make really great aspirational statements, but without thinking about kind of the different policy levers that are required to get there. So, 2020 was 21, Ryan saying, was meant to be the year that we ended child poverty in Wales. Well, but that was never going to happen without control of the social security system and significant control over the labour market as well. So I think there's I think it reinforces, really, doesn't it, the conversations we've had about, yes, there's far more that we could do at a Welsh level, but also it's about kind of redesigning that system at a UK level as well, if we're realistically going to be some of those objectives.
Thanks very much for that. There was also a comment in the chat from Alison with regards to our Gypsy Traveller communities, and this is something that I mentioned, and Bill Scott, who's on today as well from the Poverty and Inequality Commission, when he was given evidence to our committee last week, it was round about how do we actually make sure that we're supporting some of those families who find themselves in the deepest levels of poverty, and this does include our Gypsy Traveller communities. So that's maybe something that we need to keep our focus on as well, and not forget those communities. There's lots of chat and the side. Bill's also brought up the important issue around about disability benefits. Worse, 300,000 people in receipt of DLA and PIP are going to lose out on eligibility for the Warm Homes discount. The support is channeled solely to those in receipt of means tested benefits. And I think this is sometimes where we find the disconnect between means testing and eligibility, and we don't always understand the consequences and knock-on effect that can happen. And I think that's something that I'm alive to in terms of my role within the committee, where we're focused on Social Security Scotland. We need to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences from decisions that are being made. Rachel, I don't know if you want to come in and say something about the legacy benefits. You've briefly put something in the chat. bare minimum up rate in line with inflation needs to apply to the legacy benefits. So how do you think we can force that issue? What can we do that can make a change there?
Yes, I mean, it's more a kind of an administrative point that I think we should push back against the idea that it's not possible and it's too difficult and these are, complicated and, outdated IT systems, and that, obviously all the reasons that we need to push for the cost of, for the value of universal credit administered benefits to be keeping up with the real cost of living, that applies equally to those legacy benefits. So just making sure that we're explicit in demands that is about the whole social security system, not part of it or not the bit that's most straightforwardly administratively tweakable, as is often the kind of arguments that you hear back from officials at Westminster.
Thanks very much for that, Sabine.
Just quickly to say, well, you can see from the DWT food insecurity data that the levels of food insecurity will reduce for households on universal credit by 16%, but the levels of food insecurity remain the same for people on legacy benefits. So you can see their own data shows them that a policy intervention, cash first policy intervention made a difference. Thank you.
Absolutely, and as I said earlier, we're seeing that trend reversing in Scotland in terms of our food bank usage was going down with the introduction of child payment, but as soon as that uplift in UC was removed, we saw that trend reverse. And it is absolutely correct that trend never reversed itself in terms of those that were on legacy benefits that didn't get that uplift in the first place. Okay, so I think we're coming to the end. I've got a couple of minutes just to wrap up. I think there's quite a lot of emerging themes. Rachel, thank you so much for setting the context and what we're dealing with from the beginning. And some of the comments that I wrote down from yourself is that we're going to see greater poverty and destitution, and from the Joseph Rowntree estimates about 600,000 more people being into fuel poverty and food poverty, just from the decision not to increase those benefits in line with inflation. Kate, I think the stark figure that you gave us with regards to those 6 deaths, and if that was happening on our roads, how would we actually respond to it, really set the scene. And I think that we're going to see so many people in rural and more remote areas disproportionately affected by the standing charges, the rises, and how this is contrasted with these being the communities that are our powerhouses when it comes to renewable energy, and that really feels deeply unfair, doesn't it? Nerys and Stefan, thank you for talking about the community pantries, the food security, and how you recognise that £5 membership fee in itself was actually starting to impact on people in that crisis area that you've got, where you're directly helping those who are most in need and are at risk of self-disconnection. I think we're going to see that as a huge theme that's emerging over this year. I know that there was a comment in the chat before that I didn't manage to bring in, but as somebody who has a wood burner at home, there was a chat there about people using alternative means and what's the effect that's going to have. Are people in fact using unsafe ways to heat their homes? Camping stoves, etc. These are things that we need to really think about. Sabine, that cash first approach that you're talking about, that you champion, is absolutely right. The scale of suffering being unprecedented. I think that this is so true. I don't think we've seen this, even in the 2008 crash, we've not seen what we're seeing now. To me, this feels like the Great Depression in the States. If you go back to that real critical time in the 20s, when people really were in destitution. And I think that, recognising the physical and mental exhaustion of not just people that are living in that, but people who are supporting those people at the coalface. And Johnny, to lay out so clearly the disproportionate effect of poverty in Northern Ireland was quite stark. And starting to understand the drivers behind that's going to be key. And Dan, from the collective, I think that when you said, stats can't demonstrate the reality of lived experience, to me, that was a key thing to take away today. Statistics can tell you one thing and they can drive policy change, but actually understanding what that in reality means for somebody and any family that they may have is hugely important. And it's critical that if we want to participate fully in life today, we need to be digitally connected. So we need to figure out how we make sure that people that are having to choose between heating and eating don't suddenly find you know, digital connectivity being an even further fantasy away from the reality of their daily life. So thanks so much. I'm glad that this has been recorded. I'm hoping that we can gather all that information that was in the chat as well down the side so that people can refer back to that. And I'm really glad, just before I sign off, that Bill's going to be meeting with Article 12 to talk about our gypsy traveller families in Scotland and how you know, hearing from them as to how they're faring just now with this cost of living crisis. And thanks so much to the Poverty Alliance for putting this together today and for everybody for participating. So go and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.